Welcome to Sound Bites, hosted by registered dietitian nutritionist Melissa Joy Dobbins.
Hello and welcome to the Sound Bites podcast. I'm your host, Melissa Joy Dobbins, a registered dietitian nutritionist. And on this show, we delve into the science, the psychology, and the strategies behind good food and nutrition. And today's episode is all about trends and consumer insights about sustainability and plant-based diets. My guest today is Dr. Shelley Balanko. She is the Senior Vice President at the Hartman Group. She's responsible for sharing food culture insights and trends and providing strategic counsel to the food and beverage industry. Welcome to the show, Shelley.
Thanks, Melissa. It's my pleasure to be here.
Well, I should say welcome back because I've already had you on the show. We had a interesting and fun conversation back in episode 117 about trends in snacking. So I'm really excited to have you back on the show and talk about some really hot topics that are in the news these days. Before we delve into the trends and consumer insights, tell us a little bit more about the Hartman Group and your role there.
Sure. So the Hartman Group is a food culture consultancy, meaning we study consumers, we study what's going on in terms of food trends, and we also study the marketplace in terms of what kinds of attributes seem to be driving category growth. And we use those insights and trends to help our clients further their businesses. And typically our clients are folks in food and beverage manufacturing, retailing, as well as food service.
And your role?
Right now, I'm the Senior Vice President of Business Development. So I spend most of my time listening to our clients and really trying to understand the business issues that they're trying to solve, and then matching that with our products and services such that we can fulfill our goal, which is ultimately to move their businesses forward. And in the course of doing that, I have the wonderful opportunity of giving a lot of presentations about the trends and insights that we study. So that's the really fun part of my job, is sharing what we know with our clients and people like yourselves and our larger community.
Excellent. And when we last spoke, we had brainstormed about a variety of topics that you guys are working on over at Hartman and what I find interesting. And I think we put a list together about 10 different ideas. And so after we did the snacking one, we wanted to revisit, some of the newer information that you guys are working on. And that's where we came up with sustainability and plant-based diets. So tell me about some of this new research that you guys have been doing.
Sure. We've conducted 2 recent studies this year. One was on food and food technology, so the future of food, with an emphasis on technology. And that also included a deep dive into consumers' interest in plant-based foods and beverages. So looking at those conventional meat and dairy alternatives. And that was research that was conducted from both a quantitative and a qualitative perspective this past spring. And then more recently, this summer, we conducted research into sustainability and transparency, again, from qualitative and quantitative methodologies. And that was an update to work that we've been doing for the last 2 decades. Every other year, we revisit that topic to really see the evolution of consumers' engagement with all things sustainability.
On my show, I talk about the science and the research, but I'm always curious about consumer insights and where the twain shall meet, so to speak. Sometimes it's, completely opposite what consumer perceptions are versus what the science says. But, that's real life. And that's where it comes down to food preferences and food choices. So I'm really interested to hear how some of your recent findings may compare and contrast to, kind of what we're seeing in scientific research. So should we start with the innovations and the technology and maybe some of the perceptions of those? You can guide me on maybe some of the biggest ahas that you saw or where these trends are headed.
Sure. So for the last decade, consumers have been focused on everything fresh, real, and less processed. So we were really interested in understanding why consumers today seem to be receptive to new food and beverage innovations that actually have a fair amount of processing in them. So all the meat and dairy alternatives out there in the marketplace aren't terribly simple, meaning the ingredient list can be extensive. Sometimes there are difficult words to pronounce in those ingredients, and there is a fair amount of processing that goes into the creation of these products. And yet, we're seeing really strong marketplace growth in meat and dairy alternatives. So we really set out to understand, what was underneath this. Why was there this disconnect between consumers saying, no, I don't want anything like that. That sounds like Frankenfood, but actually approaching a lot of these products. So that's what we set out to discover. And what we determined is that consumers are engaging with these new food innovations largely out of taste and discovery needs, as well as health and wellness. So that was a bit of a surprise to us. So I'll pause there to see if you have a reaction to that.
I think that's a great place to start because it is interesting when you think about, and of course, I always think it's interesting what people say versus what they do. But when you think about what they're saying they're interested and not interested in, and it's almost the exact opposite with the processing or more processed foods. And like sustainability, the term processed, I think, means a lot of different things to different people. And that's why I think it's so interesting. Like you said, what's beneath these ideas and perceptions and what's motivating people. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what you found.
Qualitatively, we heard consumers talk about processing as something that they associated with food and beverage factories, whereas food science and technology, they really didn't think about it in a factory sense. And factories in the consumer's mind are associated with the potential for a company to be emphasizing its profits as opposed to the health and wellness of the consumer or the planet. And so they're making a subtle distinction between processing and science and technology. And they see that food that is leveraging science and technology applications as a bit more maybe altruistic is a bit of a strong word, but you get my meaning. They're feeling that these new applications of science and technology to food products is more in the interest of the consumer's health, as well as the health of the planet and any other animals that are inhabiting this earth.
I'm really encouraged to hear that because these scientific advancements and innovations really can drive improvements in efficiency and sustainability. And so I'm glad that consumers are feeling the love there, I guess, in that sense, and not seeing it as directly related to, big food, so to speak. But yeah, it sounds like you're teasing out those differences.
Yeah, it was really interesting to see this subtle shift start to take place. We actually, in our survey, found that 64% of consumers said that we need to find ways to meet society's nutritional needs with fewer resources like energy, water, or carbon. And we also had 52% of the population say scientific and technology innovations can make food more healthy. So for us, like I said, the last decade has been all about, fresh, real, and less processed, and going back to this kind of pastoral ideal of how our food is produced, going back to thinking about when we were an agrarian economy. And now we've got this shift, this subtle shift taking place where consumers are starting to embrace new innovations.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And I wonder if part of what's happening with this disconnect that you mentioned is the fast pace with which consumers' opinions are evolving and new products are coming into the market and different generations and so on. Did the research you did look into some of those issues?
Sure. And I think you're absolutely right. There is a generational cohort effect taking place here. So essentially, in consumer culture right now, there's a call for a healthier food system. And that's happening at this point in time in our history because we have enough young consumers, those millennials and Gen Z consumers out there who now have enough buying power, as well as we're at the right time in our history when it comes to science and technology. We have the technology to make these innovative food and beverage products at scale and more affordable than ever before. And so there's this confluence of these factors allowing the consumer to say, you know what, I want different food choices because it's possible today. And so they're asking for things like different proteins and holistic plant-based foods and responsibly grown meat and accountable companies. So there really is an interesting intersection between where we're at culturally and where we're at in our scientific progress that's enabling the consumer to act on their food values.
And I'm also wondering if we're starting to see, it seems like based on what you're saying, and I hope it's the case, where it used to seem like people would say, well, yeah, I care about feeding the world, but my direct world in life, it really takes priority. And I understand that, but is that gap narrowing a little bit where the two can cohabitate?
Yeah, we're actually seeing a really interesting shift occur. The U.S. is very much an individualistic society, and as such, we feel like individuals are largely responsible for their own fate as well as for change in the world. But we're starting to see a shift in that. Sure, we're human beings and we're somewhat self-serving in most of our choices, but we're now really starting to see consumers take a shift in perspective. There's more interest in the greater good and making choices that not only benefit oneself, but actually benefit others. So workers who are associated with all phases of food and beverage production. And certainly with the planet, wanting to have a healthier food supply for today as well as for generations to come. And consumers are really willing to put their money where this ideal is. We have research that shows that 70% of consumers say that, yes, they often pay more to buy food and drink that are better for me, for themselves. But 57% also say, I often pay more to buy foods and drinks that are better for the environment or workers. So that's not an insignificant proportion of the population.
Mm-hmm. There was a recent survey by the International Food Information Council. Every year they do their food and health survey. And in their last one, the 14th annual one, they found that 54% of consumers say it's at least somewhat important that the products they buy be produced in an environmentally sustainable way. So they did a follow-up survey to kind of take a deeper dive into what that means to people. And it mirrors kind of what you're saying, where to some people it means that it's better for the planet. To other people, it means it's better for me. And to others, it means both. So I'm wondering if, we're kind of getting away from this sort of black and white perspective of what people think about innovations and technology and sustainability, and teasing out some of those nuances, which is the essence of the work that you do with the Hartman Group. But talk to me a little bit more about the sustainability trends in general and what people are looking for. I know one of the things that I read in the Hartman materials was about soil health, and it kind of starts there. And I think that's a really exciting piece of information.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to talk about that. And I think the reason why we're not seeing this black and white distinction any longer is because consumers have redefined what quality food means. And now these attributes that you were talking about, they're no longer mutually exclusive. They're actually highly interrelated. So for the longest time, they were just thinking about food quality as the absence of processing. But now consumers are really focused more on transparency because they want to know ingredient sourcing and production practices. And they want to know those things, not just because they're nice to know and we live in an information age and we have a high need for information, but because they use that information to determine whether there are cues to indicate that that food or beverage product is actually healthy and delicious to consume and also meets with the consumer's food values and ethics. So it's really about how sustainability is no longer living in a world or a value system that's outside of the consumer's food considerations and their thoughts on their own health and wellness. All of these ideas about what's delicious and what's healthy and what's good for the planet and people and animals, they're all conflating together under this redefinition of food quality.
I'm really liking this evolution, or maybe it's just a deeper understanding of transparency, meaning that people want that information so that they can make their own decisions. And what one person decides will be different than another person, but it's that information that allows them to say, oh, this aligns with my values, that doesn't. And, from a product or manufacturing standpoint, it's not their job to say, this is this. It's their job to say, here's the information, you decide.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's more about the attribute than what you're claiming it does, because every consumer is going to look at an attribute differently. They're going to want to impute their own meaning to that attribute. There's strength in that. You can appeal to more people if you don't define what the product is really doing for them. If your product is really high in omega-3s, well, let the consumer determine, whether they want to think about that in terms of the benefit for their cognition or the benefit for their cardiovascular system. The consumer really does want to decide. But I want to get back to your question about soil health and that need for transparency and consumers to want to understand where ingredients come from and how they were grown. Because consumers are believing that if something is grown with care, meaning the absence of synthetic fertilizers, with an attitude toward preserving biodiversity, with a nod toward utilizing the best resources in the most careful way, they believe that that product is going to be healthier for them, taste better, because it all starts with the soil. If we don't take care of our soil health, we can't expect the individual ingredient, whether it's a grain or a vegetable, to be nutrient dense. And that's one of the major needs that consumers have. And so, again, going back to that notion that consumers will impute their own meaning to things, if you're telling a story about soil health, for some consumers, they'll interpret that to mean, oh, great, well, if the microbiome of the soil is healthy, that's going to improve the health of my own personal microbiome. For others, if you're talking about soil health and the care with which the farmer has raised or grown these ingredients, they might think about that as, oh, okay, that's so much healthier for the farmer and the rest of the farm workers, as well as healthier for our water system and the planet more generally. So yeah, it's giving consumers information such that they have the latitude to make their own judgments and applications to that information is definitely where the consumer wants to be today.
Yeah. And like I said, it's just very encouraging to hear, because as a dietitian who has worked with thousands of patients and clients one-on-one and then has transitioned into the communications world, I always say it's very easy to work with a patient or client one-on-one and address their needs and individualize everything. But then when you try to communicate to the masses, things get lost in translation and they get generalized. And I think that's some of the criticism of kind of oversimplifying things. But do you think that people, it sounds like if they're they're doing more critical thinking, they're gathering the information, they're making their own decisions, which is what we want people to do. Do you think they're less likely to fall for hype and marketing, which is rampant?
Yes. Consumers have gotten a lot more food literate in the last decade. And so, yes, they are very apt to question claims and call outs on packaging. They're a little bit wary of marketing speak. And so they will do their due diligence. Of course, some consumers will do a lot of due diligence, others not as much. But generally speaking, consumers are wary. They will take the time to flip a package over, read the ingredients. And that's why it's so important to tell ingredient stories, production stories, because the consumer is going to ferret out that information, especially if it's a new product. If it's something that they've been using for a long period of time, they tend not to exercise as much scrutiny. But for new things, certainly, they're going to take the time to look at those ingredients, investigate the brand. And like I said, some consumers will do that very diligently, others in a more cursory fashion. But yeah, we've got a food literate consumer base that has all the power that they need at their fingertips with our smartphones. Mm-hmm. So it's easy for the consumer to find what meets their food values and determine what doesn't, and leave that product on the shelf.
Right. For somebody else who it does meet their needs. I always like that choice.
Sure.
They're making more informed choices, which is, again, excellent news. And maybe looking at the ingredients and say, okay, well, why is this particular ingredient in there, instead of, well, I don't recognize this, I can't pronounce it, so I shouldn't eat it. But asking the questions, okay, what's the purpose of this ingredient? Oh, maybe this is another word for vitamin C, and it has, health benefits, but also has certain functions in the product itself.
And moreover, asking themselves, and what will that ingredient do for me? One of the major trends right now is around personalized wellness. And more consumers believe that their health and wellness needs are unique to themselves. And so they're looking for foods and beverages that are specifically suited to their objectives, not their neighbors, not their sisters, and not their coworkers. Each individual will be looking at a product and its ingredient list and its nutrition facts panel with a different set of needs and circumstances in mind.
Very exciting time. So let's talk more about sustainability and also plant-based, the whole plant-based, plant-forward movement, and what that means to consumers and what they're looking for.
Sure. So consumers are interested in plant-based foods because everyone's known since childhood that you should eat your fruits and vegetables. Mm-hmm. But consumption of fruits and vegetables in the United States has certainly not gone up over the years. So even though we know this, we're not really doing it. Part of it has to do with the fact that incorporating more fruits and vegetables into our diet can be challenging if you don't have the skill or the time. And then if you've bought these products and haven't had a chance to utilize them, they spoil quickly. And nobody wants that. That's throwing money away, and it's also contributing to the food waste problem, which is becoming a huge sustainability concern among U.S. consumers. Mm-hmm. So for those reasons, consumers aren't incorporating more just straight out fruits and vegetables into their diet. So enter plant-based alternatives. It seems to be a convenient and still affordable way to improve our plant consumption. And so we see a really strong rise in the volume growth of milk alternatives, meat substitutes. Even pulses are getting a little bit of a lift, but vegetables and nuts, they're pretty much flat in terms of per capita volume growth. It's a way of doing what you always knew that you should, but in a way that works with modern life.
Yeah, we all know that we need to eat more plants. And what I've found interesting, the milk alternatives have really been around for quite some time, but that category keeps growing and growing. Now the meat alternatives are really hitting the scene hard. And it's kind of made us think, oh yeah, this is sort of similar to the milk alternatives. And what are the trends there and what are people looking for? And what I've found interesting is that even though people tend to be incorporating more of these plant-based milk and meat alternatives, that they're still consuming the animal-based ones. It's not an either or. It's a this and that, which I think is interesting.
You're absolutely right. When we did the research in the spring, what we found is that as consumers are changing their orientation to animal products, they take three interacting paths. So you're right. They don't take just a single path, but one of three depending on the occasion. So for some consumers, they'll be trading up within animal products, meaning, well, they might not be having, conventionally raised beef. They might trade up to grass-fed or trade up to something like salmon. That same consumer, other times, will just, rather than making a trade up, they'll just reduce the frequency with which they might be eating meat or conventional dairy, or they'll reduce their portion size. And then the third path is trading in plants. So just adding more vegetables or legumes and a greater portion size on their plate, or replacing some meat with a meat analog that's plant-based. So the same consumer will engage in all three of those behaviors.
Very interesting. And then there's also, in addition to the meat alternatives and substitutes, there's the blended products. What did you find with regard to those blended burgers that are half meat, half plant? Are consumers liking that option?
Sure. For some consumers, they definitely appreciate that. They appreciate that they get the flavor and texture that's very familiar, and yet they feel that they're doing something healthier for themselves, and they feel that they're doing something healthier for the environment. So there really is a time and a place for those products, just like there's a time and a place for the completely plant-based burger or the completely animal-based burger. And it really just is very occasion specific. Today's consumer doesn't really embrace a whole lot of restriction and denial. Mm-hmm. Surprise, surprise. And so they take a pretty balanced approach. Sometimes opting for the animal-based option, sometimes opting for a blend, and sometimes going for the entirely plant-based. It really just depends on the occasion. Certainly there are consumers among us who are committed vegan and vegetarians who are more consistent in their food choices. But mainstream consumers want the flexibility of choosing the option that's right for them in the moment.
Right. And I mentioned the IFIC survey, and one of the other interesting things that they touched on with regard to the different choices that we've been talking about and these purchasing decisions, they said while a third of consumers are making or ordering meals without meat to reduce their consumption, only 27% of those are opting for the plant-based beef substitutes, whereas 55% are choosing, the more traditional beans, rice, lentil, or grain-based dishes, and 54% choosing salads. So to your point, there's a lot of different paths and behaviors. And I'm guessing based on our previous conversation in the other episode about snacking, when you said that there's, depends on the day or day part maybe, or the situation that will dictate what option they feel is best for them at that time.
Absolutely. And one of the things that our research uncovered in terms of motivations for plant-based meat and dairy alternative purchases is that the taste and discovery element is pretty huge. It's actually number one. And consumers are approaching some of these new products in the market simply because of the novelty factor. So that's going to drive some choice for a while. And then they'll go back to more familiar alternatives, and then they'll try the newer products that have yet to hit the marketplace yet, and they'll just tack back and forth. Because in food culture today, we have basically unbridled choice, and consumers like to exercise that. So it's just about fulfilling our desire for newness a lot of the time.
So they'll come for the novelty and hopefully stay for the taste in those situations. It was also interesting that 70% of meat substitute eaters still eat beef at least once a week. So it just speaks to what we've been saying. And you mentioned familiarity a couple of times. And, it just seems like if the familiarity is there and the cultural acceptance, that really those are two green lights as far as, hey, I'm willing to try something new because that's somewhat familiar. And the innovations that may have brought this to the table, I feel are culturally acceptable. So I'm going to embrace this.
That's a really interesting point that you raise about the cultural acceptability and how it can really drive adoption among consumers and actually growth in the marketplace. And that's one of the factors that we included in our feedback loop to explain why the natural and organic marketplace has really grown in the last 20 years. I mean, if you think about 15, 20 years ago, people thought, culturally, that, if you ate a lot of natural or organic foods, you might be like a crunchy hippie. Mm-hmm. Very common stereotype. But today, consumption of organic and natural foods is very mainstream. And so, there's three components that have really allowed that to become part of our regular everyday culture. Decreased barriers to actually finding and affording natural and organic foods, the increased benefits that consumers were realizing from their consumption, like exposure to fewer chemicals, just feeling that they're healthier for them and the planet. But then finally, the last piece of our feedback loop was the cultural change. Not only did it become socially acceptable to eat that hippie granola food, but it actually, in some circles, there's social pressure. And the foods and beverages that we choose today are basically a moral badge. They show everyone around you what you care about with regard to your own body, as well as your community and the planet.
Yeah, it becomes a big part of your identity.
It really does. Food is personal. Food is identity. And being in step with your culture is not insignificant. It's very hard to buck tide for very long.
Mm-hmm, right. So speaking of familiarity and culturally acceptable, there is a sustainable protein option that is very viable, but there's an ick factor, the insect protein. Tell me what you found with that.
Oh, that's a good one. Yes, that is the least acceptable option. We, in our research, had tested a few food or future forward type foods, like a GMO salmon. We had tested a lab-based milk, a lab-based meat, as well as insects. And across the board, the insects just scored low. And that is the cultural ick factor. When consumers are considering a new food, especially one that's outside of our culture or been introduced through food science and technology, they're going to weigh several factors with a central question at the heart, which is, does the end justify the means? And among, I think it's like 8 variables that get weighed in the course of answering that question, one of them is cultural tolerability. And unfortunately for us right now, insects don't meet the cultural tolerability test. The ick factor is just too strong, even though they might intellectually understand that insects are really high in protein. They're a sustainable protein source. Once ground and made into a flour, there really isn't much of a taste barrier to overcome.
Or a crunch barrier.
Or a crunch, yeah, exactly. Or a crunch in legs and eyeballs barrier. But yeah, it doesn't meet that criteria. And so for most consumers, what we heard is that they weren't that interested except under dire circumstances like war or the apocalypse.
Mm-hmm. Right. And I believe we're speaking primarily about American consumers because there are other cultures that are more accepting of insect protein.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And they get that. They totally understand that, food cultures around the world embrace insects as part of their diet. And so again, intellectually, not a problem. A lot of consumers think, yeah, that could be a wonderful solution. But because food is so culturally bound, even though it's just one variable within, several that are considered as the consumer's making that calculus of whether they're going to go with a new food innovation, it can't be overcome because culture is so strong.
Mm-hmm. Right.
I'm not saying that culture never changes. That's why the Hartman Group studies culture.
Mm-hmm.
And who knows, maybe 10 years from now, our culture will evolve to a place where we really embrace insects as a part of our diet. Because who knows what circumstances are going to foster cultural change in the future.
And further innovation as well, right?
Absolutely.
So you're saying that the key motivation for plant-based eating isn't necessarily environmental, but more health motivated. But talk to me about this plant-based halo that we're seeing as well.
Because we've been told forever to eat our fruits and vegetables, we know that they're good for us. Plants also have a halo that comes from their ancient association with wellness and medicine. Many ancient cultures relied on plants to not just feed, but also heal. So they definitely have that halo. And plants are also associated with eating clean and leaving a smaller footprint on the earth. So for those 3 main reasons, plants certainly do have a halo, and all things plant-based are benefiting from that halo. However, we are starting to see more progressive consumers start to scrutinize the plant source in certain snacks and meal components and new products on the market. Because there's this growing belief among the progressive, so the very knowledgeable and trend-forward consumers, that not all plant sources are created equally. For example, we hear some progressive wellness consumers be skeptical of products that include soy. They would rather have that product be based in pea protein instead. So the halo is starting to tarnish, meaning that consumers are just going to give more scrutiny to plant-based products and pay a little bit more attention to how extensively processed they might be. So again, that goes back to that call for a healthier food system. Yes, consumers have embraced plant-based products today, but they're going to be looking for more holistic, really nutrient-dense plant-based ingredients in the future.
Right. And that sort of brings us full circle because I have heard a lot of criticism from people about, well, this plant-based, meat alternative has a really long ingredients list and it's, processed or highly processed. And when you compare the calories and the fat and the saturated fat, sometimes I've seen some comparisons that are just right on par, with a regular burger. So it kind of reminds me of like a gluten-free cookie. It's nice to have that option if you are celiac, have celiac disease or gluten intolerant, and you don't want to make your own and you want to be able to buy a gluten-free cookie. A gluten-free cookie is still a cookie. And so I think consumers are a little bit more savvy with regard to looking at everything that's in it versus just sort of like we said earlier, like the hype in the marketing, like this is plant-based.
Yeah, absolutely. Like with all things, when something's new and we initially embrace it, there's a period of time where we need to kind of catch up. And so The plant-based alternative marketplace really exploded. There were a ton of new products in the last couple of years. There continue to be many innovations. And so, the consumer was experimenting. And now that we're starting to be more knowledgeable about engaging with these categories, and the categories are maturing and there are more sources of choice, more competition in the various categories, consumers can now think more critically and make comparisons. And that's what we're starting to see, is that they are going to be scrutinizing the plant-based junk, just like they started to scrutinize the natural and organic junk food and then the gluten-free junk food. If health and wellness is their primary driver, they're going to be scrutinizing and making determinations about plant-based junk food. Mm-hmm. So yes, as we gain more familiarity with the categories, the consumer will start to make choices that ensure that their plant-based selection really fits all of their food values.
So based on all this new research, where do you see these trends heading? We kind of see the direction, but if you could kind of paint a picture of the future of food for us.
Sure. Well, like I said, in the past, when consumers were making decisions about their food and beverage, they might have thought about health and wellness separately from high quality food or indulgent food, separate from sustainable. Today, that's not the case. All of these things are intertwined because high quality food is healthy and sustainably grown and tasty. So all of these things together ladder up to quality. In the future, we think that will be increasingly the case. For a long time, we had advised clients that sustainability attributes weren't absolutely necessary. They were nice to have and good stories to tell, but not essential stories to tell, because for most consumers, they weren't making purchase decisions based on those criteria. We would say that we are now starting to see sustainability attributes really make the difference. So in the future, I can see that that will be something that consumers will be looking more and more to as a driver of purchase.
And I'll be interested to hear, as your work continues to move forward, about packaging, which we could do a whole other segment on if you guys do some consumer insights on that, because I see so many opportunities and potential for improvements there.
Absolutely.
Is there anything else you wanted to share about this new research? And of course, I'd love to hear about what you guys are working on in any upcoming projects.
Sure. I just wanted to say that, yes, in our transparency and sustainability study of 2019, we did address the packaging issue, because single-use packages is definitely on consumers' radar screen, and they are increasingly scrutinizing their food and beverage packaging. Not just to make sure that it's, right sized for themselves and their households so that there isn't waste, which is a sustainability issue, but also to ensure that it's not overpackaged and that the packaging materials are more sustainable. So yes, that's absolutely a trend that is starting to grow. And I'd be happy to talk all about that at another time. And then what's new? What's on the horizon? Well, this quarter, we are engaged in a study of the diversity of American foodways, which is what are all the diverse things that American consumers are eating and how are diverse Americans eating? So it's kind of a double-edged sword on diversity. And so that's going to be very exciting since our food culture is very, very rich. We've got a lot of options. So I'm excited to learn about that. And then at the beginning of 2020, we will be revisiting the natural and organic marketplace. And following that, we will be studying how consumers are procuring foods these days. No longer do we get the vast majority of all of our food and beverage, or all of it, I should say, at the grocery store. When 30, 40 years ago, that was pretty much your only option, is you went to your local grocery store and that's where you got your food and beverage, unless perhaps you were on a road trip and you stopped at a convenience store. But today it's very different. With all the changes that are going on in the brick and mortar retail landscape, as well as all the online options for procuring food, we're going to be diving deep into that.
How exciting. Oh, I can't wait to hear all those juicy details.
Yeah, it should be fun.
Well, thank you so much for sharing all of this information with us and coming on the show again. It's always a pleasure to talk with you.
Oh, well, it's my pleasure, Melissa. I really enjoy it.
Okay, well, I'm a big fan and always curious about what's going to come out next and what people are saying. So thank you so much. And I will have all of the information about the Hartman Group, the website, the social media handles and everything in my show notes at soundbitesrd.com. And everybody can follow you like I do. And for everybody listening, as always, enjoy your food with health in mind. Till next time.
For more information, visit soundbitesrd.com. Music by Dave Burke.